Today we will be looking at a case from the first part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. In 1831, England stood on the precipice of a new era, marked by industrialisation, social reform, and the dawn of a Victorian age. But in this particular year, King William IV was on the English throne. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, with innovations and technological advancements that were reshaping the landscape. Steam-powered machinery, coal mining, and the rise of the textile industry were driving the country's economic growth. But for many, these technical advancements seemed far removed from their daily lives. In the English villages, poverty was ever present and a deeply entrenched reality for many. The rural poor faced numerous challenges, including limited access to education, healthcare, and job opportunities. Many villagers relied on agriculture for their livelihoods, but the unpredictability of farming often meant that they struggled to make ends meet during lean times. The Enclosure Acts, which were a series of laws enacted in England that allowed for the privatisation of common lands. This resulted in increased agricultural efficiency, but also caused many problems for the poorer members in a community, as rural workers often lost access to these lands. Consequently, the impoverished were forced to work under challenging conditions, usually working for meagre wages in the fields of wealthier landowners. The living conditions in many villages were cramped and unsanitary, with overcrowded cottages lacking basic amenities. Assistance for the very poor was limited, and those who fell into poverty could face harsh penalties, including the workhouse, a feared institution of last resort for the destitute. Overall, life for the poor in English villages in 1830 was marked by hardship, limited opportunities, and a constant struggle for survival. And it was in one such village, in the English county of Kent, that on the 4th of March 1831, a bright and amiable 9-year-old boy named Richard Taylor embarked on a journey from his home in Strood to Aylesford, a distance of around 9 miles. The boy possessed an unusual level of intelligence for his age, and was on a mission to collect his father's weekly parish allowance, a sum of 9 shillings. A weekly parish allowance, also known as outdoor relief or poor relief, was a form of financial assistance provided by a parish or local government to individuals and families in need. This allowance was intended to help the destitute, elderly, or disabled individuals, as well as families facing financial hardship, so they could cover basic living expenses such as food, clothing, and shelter. The amount of the allowance could vary, depending on the local parish's resources and policies, but it was typically modest and designed to provide a subsistence level of support to those who could not support themselves. Richard Taylor's father received this allowance. Although he worked making candles, his family lived in very poor circumstances. Dressed in a southwester hat, a striped handkerchief stylishly wrapped around his neck, a blue jacket, brown trousers, and shoes with stockings, he was the picture of youthful innocence, although his attire unmistakably reflected his humble background. Prior to his departure, young Richard, with his eyes filled with anticipation, approached his father and asked if he may lend him a knife, as he wanted to make a bow and arrow on his return from Aylesford. It was a simple request from a 9-year-old boy who planned to turn his weekly errand into an adventure. His father obliged and gave his son a knife. Richard's journey to Aylesford unfolded as it often did, uneventful and familiar. Upon reaching his destination, he was met by Mr. Cutbirth, the parish's relieving officer, who handed him the precious 9 shillings, a sum that held immense significance for his family's modest livelihood. Richard's father had been diligent in imparting practical lessons to his son, not only about the importance of the weekly allowance, but also on how to safeguard it discreetly. Young Richard, the embodiment of both innocence and resourcefulness, had absorbed these teachings well, with a child's ingenuity and an eye for detail that defied his years. He had devised a foolproof method for ensuring the safety of the silver coins. Carefully, he tucked the money into a small bag, not much larger than the palm of his hand. This was no ordinary bag. It was safeguard against any potential misfortune that might befall his journey back home. The final touch in this arrangement was a mitten he wore, a simple garment, turned into the guardian of this precious cargo. He then concealed the bag within the mitten, which rendered it secure from prying eyes. This was a ritual that he followed diligently, week after week, as he knew that 9 shillings were very important to his family. Richard would usually return home at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a time eagerly anticipated by the family, especially Richard's father, who was always relieved to see that his son had returned safely home with the 9 shillings, a small sum, but very important to Mr. Taylor. Yet on this particular day, 3 o'clock came and went, and Richard had not returned. This was strange, as he was usually so dependable. As hours passed, his father was gripped by a growing sense of unease. It was more than mere concern. An unsettling fear had taken hold of him. By the following morning, that initial worry had grown into something more profound, a fear that clung to his father's every thought and would not release its grip. With every passing moment, his apprehension grew stronger, leaving him with no choice but to embark on a journey to Aylesford to try and find out what had happened to his son. When in Aylesford, Mr. Taylor spoke to Mr. Cutbirth, the parish's relieving officer, who confirmed that young Richard had indeed collected the money. Mr. Cutbirth added that the boy seemed to be in good spirits. Mr. Taylor retraced the path back to Strood, looking for signs of his son. As news of the missing boy spread, concerned villagers joined the search. But despite searching from dawn till dusk, they found no sign of Richard. The young boy had seemingly vanished. It was a confounding and harrowing mystery, and soon the story of Richard Taylor was being talked about not only in the surrounding villages, but in the nearby city of Rochester and the market town of Maidstone, both of which, like Strood, sat on the banks of the River Medway. But it was in Strood that the disappearance was felt the most. A heavy cloud of uncertainty descended, casting an enduring, ominous shadow over the village, as the community was left looking for the answer as to what had happened to young Richard Taylor. Weeks passed, and there had been no news of the boy. That was until the 11th of May, more than 2 months since Richard's disappearance, that the chilling truth of his fate was unearthed. A man named Mr. Izzard, who had been walking a winding path deep within a wooded area, stumbled upon a heartbreaking scene. The lifeless body of a boy lay in a ditch, discarded and forgotten. The child's mitten had been brutally cut from his left hand, his clothes dishevelled as if he had put up a fierce struggle. The state of decomposition made it impossible to ascertain the cause of death, but the bloodstains on the clothing told a horrifying tale. It was clear that he had met a gruesome end, falling victim to a vicious crime. Near the body lay a rusty white-horn hand knife, which had all the hallmarks of being the weapon used in this terrible act. The authorities were contacted, and the body was taken to Rochester, where it was examined by Dr. Edward Seaton and Dr. Bryant. They soon ascertained that the boy had succumbed to a wound that someone had inflicted upon his throat, using a sharp-pointed instrument, the mark still very much evident. The coroner subsequently ruled out the possibility of this being self-inflicted by the deceased. As evidence was gathered, the magistrate ordered the arrest of a man named Mr. Bell and his 2 sons, John Bird Bell and James Bell, aged 14 and 11. They resided in the nearby poorhouse, not too far from the isolated place where the body had been found. The knife found at the scene was identified as belonging to John Bird Bell and was a very significant piece of evidence that implicated him in the crime. The investigation persisted under the watchful eye of the magistrates in Rochester, and as it unfolded, the evidence increasingly pointed to the 2 boys as the likely perpetrators of this heinous deed. During this process, the body of Richard Taylor was exhumed for further examination. John and James Bell were then taken to the graveyard to observe the macabre operation. While John maintained a haunting silence, without hesitation, James cooperated with the investigators. With a mixture of dread and determination, he reached into the pockets of the deceased boy's clothing. His trembling fingers found a knife, but it was not just a gruesome relic of their malevolent deed. It was a knife that Richard's father had given him on the day that he disappeared. Although the knife had previously been discovered, it had been decided that it would be buried with Richard. It was clear to the investigators that robbery had been the boy's motive to commit such an awful act, but the full story was yet to be revealed. The younger of the brothers, James, could no longer bear the weight of the dark secrets. In a moment of confession, he disclosed the chilling truth that he and John had harboured murderous intentions towards their unsuspecting victim for some time. They had patiently watched and learned from Richard's frequent travels between Strood and Aylesford. Their wicked plot finally unfolded on the 4th of March, when John ambushed young Richard in the woods, while James stood as lookouts. Following the terrible act, John handed James a portion of the ill-gotten money, sealing their sinister pact. James Bell was released, while his brother John was arrested and charged with murder. The trial began at Maidstone Assizes on the 29th of July 1831, and when the judge asked him how he pleaded, John replied in a loud and firm voice, "Not guilty." The deceased boy's father told the court how each week his son would go to Aylesford to collect the weekly parish allowance, a sum of either 8 or 9 shillings. Mr. Taylor said that usually his 7-year-old daughter would accompany the boy, but on this day his son went alone. Mr. Taylor was very emotional during his testimony, and at one stage was so overcome that he fainted. When he recomposed himself, he went on to tell the courts how he was taken to the place where Mr. Izzard had discovered the child's body, and although the face was unrecognisable, he identified the knife as the one that he had loaned his son on the morning of March the 4th, and the clothes matched those his son had worn. He went on to say that his son was a spirited little boy and would have tried valiantly to defend himself. A witness named Henry Lewington, who was a warrant officer on board His Majesty's ship Warrior, based at the dockyard in Chatham, told the court that on the day that Richard Taylor had gone missing, he saw the boy walking towards Aylesford. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. He said that he walked part of the way with him. Then in the afternoon, he saw him again, but this time he was walking with the defendant and his brother. He said he last saw them near the Bell public house. He added that when he heard that young Richard Taylor had gone missing, he advised the boy's father on what he had seen. He also assisted in the search. Mr. Lewington said that during the search, he came across the defendant and his brother, and when he inquired about the boy's whereabouts, John Bird informed him that they had only walked together as far as the turnip field, and they had last seen young Richard heading along the Benham Road. Mrs. Jones, who lived in a cottage near Benham Common, had also seen the boys together. Constable Charles Patterson informed the court that when he was escorting the defendant to Maidstone Prison, he acknowledged his brother's statement as being true and indicated a nearby pond where he had cleansed his hands of the victim's blood on his way home from committing the terrible deed. He said that John also pointed to the entrance leading to the location of the murder, saying, "That's where I killed the poor boy," and added, "He's better off than I am now. Don't you think he is, sir?" An observation to which the constable agreed. The constable said that subsequently, John Bell provided a more detailed account of the circumstances surrounding the murder. He explained that he had encountered the deceased on his way home and engaged in conversation with him. He persuaded the boy to enter the woods, and after leading him through numerous twists and turns, they both sat down. He claimed that he had lost his way, and the distressed boy, not knowing how to exit, began to cry. It was at that moment that he lunged at him, stabbing him in the throat. He faced some difficulty in locating the money, but eventually found it in the boy's left hand, from where he retrieved it. He mentioned that the sum consisted of 3 half-crowns, a shilling and a sixpence, with the 2 latter coins given to his brother. He further expressed a desire for his brother to witness his execution, believing it would serve as a warning to him, seemingly fully aware of the grave crime that he had committed, and that a hanging could possibly await him. John Railton, a line draper from Rochester, told the court that he remembered the defendant coming into his shop and asking for change for half a crown. He said that this was after the Taylor boy had gone missing. After the final witnesses gave evidence, Justice Gasserly turned to the jury and explained to them that deciding young John Bird Bell's fate would require their full attention and consideration. The jury, however, did not leave the jury box, and after only a few moments, returned with the verdict of guilty. However, they recommended mercy for the boy due to his extreme youth and the unorthodox and unnatural manner in which he had been raised. The judge, however, turned to the young defendant and sentenced him to death by hanging. He was then taken back to his cell at Maidstone Prison, where the boldness that he had displayed in court quickly disappeared, and he wept openly. His mother visited the following afternoon, and he blamed her for his predicament. Later that evening, after the chaplain had delivered the condemned sermon, John made a full confession. His account closely mirrored the trial testimony, but included harrowing details of the victim's actions just before the murder. He shared that as he approached young Richard Taylor with a knife in hand, the terrified boy, sensing his murderous intent, fell to his knees, offering all the money he had, his knife, his cap, and anything else he could provide. He also promised eternal loyalty and vowed never to disclose the incident if his life was spared. Nevertheless, these heartfelt pleas had no effect, and without a word, John said that he killed him. At 11:30 the next day, which was a Monday, the prison bell solemnly tolled, signalling the preparations for the execution. Following the completion of the binding procedure, the convicted boy, accompanied by the chaplain, walked resolutely to the gallows. As he stood on the platform, he gazed around him with unflinching eyes, his complexion unchanged. He looked straight ahead and declared in a steady and audible voice, "Lord, have mercy upon us. Pray, gracious Lord, have mercy upon us. Lord, have mercy upon us. All who witness this, take heed from my example." When asked if he had any final words, he repeated the same prayer and added, "Lord, have mercy upon my troubled soul." The lever was then pulled, and in front of 8,000 people, John Bird Bell was hanged. His body was then given to Rochester surgeons for dissection. At the time of his death, he was 14 years old. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case